8:41 in the evening. I remember the exact number, because I always remember numbers. It's the first thing they teach you when you become responsible for who lives and who doesn't. You don't cry when you take a hit. You read the clock. You count the beats. You keep your hands steady enough to do the thing that has to be done. My father was standing in the middle of the banquet table, a glass of bourbon tilting in his hand, telling 8 strangers his favorite story in the world. The story about the daughter who quit. She cried her way home after exactly 2 weeks at Lackland, he said, his voice ringing out like he was delivering a eulogy for someone who wasn't dead yet. 2 weeks. And now she does data entry for some insurance company out in the suburbs. My family's got one hero. He tipped his chin toward the stage, where my little brother stood in his navy dress blues and won. Well, that's Rachel. A few laughs dropped onto the table. The awkward kind people let out when they're not sure they're supposed to laugh, and then laugh because the person next to them did. I was standing at the back of the room, my back against the cold wall, holding a glass of water I hadn't touched. I was the only person in a hall of 800 who didn't have a seat at the table for the honored family. My heart was beating 60 beats a minute, slow and even, the way it always beat even when the ground beneath me was on fire. And then in the row of chairs to the right, maybe 15 meters from where I stood, a man pushed back his chair and stood up. He stood with effort, one hand braced on the edge of the table, because one of his legs wasn't flesh and bone but metal and carbon fiber. The prosthetic touched down on the wooden floor with a dry sound, and that sound, I'll explain later why, sent a chill down my spine before I could even see his face clearly. He looked straight at me. His eyes were red. And he spoke a name I hadn't heard anyone say out loud in 11 years. The whole hall went silent. The bourbon in my father's hand froze in midair. His laugh died in his throat before it could become a whole sound. But before I tell you who that man was, why he knew that name, and why a Navy SEAL, my own brother, had just gone pale looking down at where I stood, you need to go back 8 hours. And further than that, 11 years, to a ridgeline in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, where a 21-year-old boy hummed an off-key song right before the helicopter door slid open. My name is Rachel Marsh. To my family, for almost 20 years, I was the daughter who quit. They never once asked me where I'd gone after those 2 weeks. That morning, Ryan called me at 12:40. "You coming?" he asked. His voice was still the same as when he was 10 and wanted me to do something for him, lifting a little at the end, a bit of hope he'd never admit to. "We're getting this. Gala. Honoring the whole platoon. There'll be generals, press. Mom wants the whole family there." He didn't say Dad wants. He didn't need to. I understood what my father wanted from occasions like this. He wanted a stage, a crowd, and a backdrop to stand in front of while he told the story of a military career that had never existed. "I'll come," I said. I always came. That's the thing you need to understand about me before you judge me. I've flown into places where every survival instinct in the human body screams at you to turn around. But I never found a way to set my family straight about who I actually was. Because setting them straight, with my family, would have sounded like bragging. And half of what I did, I wasn't even allowed to say out loud. My file has lines that are blacked out, operation names I signed an oath to carry to my grave. So I let them believe the easier version. The weak daughter who cried and quit. It made my father feel taller. And I told myself, for 18 years, that letting a man feel taller was a kind of kindness. I was wrong about that. But I didn't know I was wrong until 8:41 that evening. I drove to the convention center alone. In my coat pocket, my fingers found what they always found, a metal dog tag, worn smooth at the edges, with a small notch in the lower left corner. That notch wasn't made by the manufacturer. I knew exactly where it came from. I'd carried this dog tag 11 years, and I touched it so many times a day that I no longer noticed I was doing it. It was like a second heartbeat, beating outside my chest. I walked through the revolving glass door of the convention center, and the first thing my brain did, before I could see the banner, before I heard the music, was sweep the whole lobby and read every body in it. It's a habit I can't switch off. They call it triage. You look at a room, and before you see the clothes, the smiles, the names on the badges, you see the injuries. The man at the registration desk leaning his weight off his right hip, an old herniated disc. The woman carrying the champagne tray holding her left shoulder higher than her right, a rotator cuff injury that never quite healed. And a young server walked past me, limping slightly, loading weight too fast onto his left leg. Torn ACL, I thought. Maybe 6 months ago. Rehab not finished. He was too young to know he'd feel that knee for the rest of his life. I wasn't young. My own right shoulder had been aching since the air conditioning came on. 11 years of fast rope burns and hard landings don't ask your permission before they show up at a party. I read the wounds of every single person in that hall. Not one of them read mine. Then the smell hit me. Coffee from the hot drink station mixed with the glue of the freshly laid carpet. And for one dizzying moment, I wasn't in the convention center anymore. I was in the cabin of an 60 Pave Hawk, the smell of fuel and hot rubber, the sound of rotors tearing the air, and a young man's voice humming an old country song completely off-key, a song about a dirt road and one last ride home. I blinked, and the carpet glue was just carpet glue again. That's how the past still finds me. Not through thought. Through the nose. Through the ears. I found my family near the stage. My father, Ray Marsh, 68 years old, wearing the sport coat he only pulled out for occasions with an audience, was telling a couple about his time in the Marines. I grew up hearing that version. The truth, which I knew and which he believed no one knew, was that he'd been dropped from Marine boot camp in the 5th week over a knee that gave out during physical training. After that, he drove long-haul trucks for 40 years. He never went overseas. He told his hero story so loudly that sometimes he fooled even himself. That's the thing I came to understand about my father, slowly and late. He didn't tell it loud because he believed it. He told it loud because if he ever stopped telling it, he'd have to hear the silence underneath. And in that silence was a 33-year-old man with a broken knee and a chest badge that never got pinned on. My mother, Diane, 65, stood a few steps away. And she was doing the thing she always did so she wouldn't have to look anyone in the eye. She was polishing a glass. There was a whole professional staff for that, but she'd taken a wine glass off a tray and was turning it in her palm with a cloth napkin, slow, thorough, as if the clarity of that glass were the most important thing in her life. My mother's busy hands. All through my childhood, every time my father said something cruel, my mother would find something to wipe. A plate. A tabletop. A glass. It was how she made herself absent while standing right there. "There you are," she said when she saw me, and she smiled, but her eyes had already slid past my shoulder toward the stage, toward Ryan. "You'll be at that table." She nodded toward the back of the room, to a round table far from the stage, where the distant relatives and +1 friends were seated. "The main family table is full. You understand." I understood. And Ryan stepped down from the stage to hug me, and for a second I saw my little brother, not a chief special warfare operator, not a Navy SEAL, just the boy who used to sleep in the hallway outside my room on stormy nights. "Thanks for coming," he said quietly into my ear. "I know, Dad." "I know." "Thank you." He knew how Dad treated me. He never knew why that was such an injustice. To Ryan, I was the sister he loved, the one who'd quit long ago and lived a small life, and he loved me for it. His love was just as blind as Dad's contempt. It just didn't make me bleed the same way. I walked to my table at the back of the room, and I sat down, and I began doing the thing I'm best at in the world after saving people. I began making myself invisible. That's when I looked up at the large projection screen above the stage, where the organizers were running a test of a video. and I saw a name come up. The code name of an operation. My hand, under the table, tightened around the dog tag in my pocket until the metal edge cut into my palm. I knew that name. I'd been there. The ceremony began, and I sat at the farthest table, and I let it wash over me like water over stone. You need to understand this about that moment, because it matters. I had no plan. I hadn't brought anything in a briefcase. I wasn't setting up what was about to happen. People like to imagine moments like this are an elaborate trap, a revenge staged over months. Not with me. I came to be Ryan's sister. I came to disappear politely, eat a dry piece of chicken, clap at the right times, and drive home. The only strength I brought that night was the ability to endure without breaking. It's a kind of strength no one in the room could see, because it looks exactly like submission. A woman at my table, the wife of some cousin, leaned over and asked what I did for a living. I opened my mouth to answer. I wasn't even sure what I was going to say. But my father, 3 tables away, had the hearing of a predator when it came to anything that might make me look like I had value. He turned in his chair. "Don't let her scare you," he said loudly, with a smirk, cutting in before I could get out a word. "Rachel does odd jobs here and there. She wasn't cut out for the service. Too soft." "Right, sweetheart." He didn't look at me when he asked. He never looked at me when he hurt me. It wasn't a question. It was an order to agree. "Yes, Dad," I said. 2 words. I read them out the way I'd read a casualty report. Flat, precise, without a single tremor. You might ask why. Why I didn't stand up. Why I let it go on. And I'll tell you the truth. Even though it doesn't make me look any better, a part of me believed that's what a grown person does. That dignity is something you keep inside, silent without needing a witness. That if you know who you are, then other people getting you wrong can't touch you. I believed that for 11 years. And for 11 years, I didn't realize that my silence didn't only hide me. It also hid the boy who died so that I could sit at that table. But I'm not there yet. Not yet. A while later, my mother found me between 2 segments of the program. "Could you go out to the car and get Ryan's box of photos for me?" she asked. I left it on the back seat. "They want to show a few from when he was little. You're the only one I can ask. The others are all busy." I wasn't busy. That's what she meant without saying it. In this room, my time was the cheapest thing there was. I went out to the parking lot. Night had fallen. The air outside was damp and cool, and after the artificial climate-controlled air inside, it felt so real it almost hurt. I found my mother's car, got the box of photos, and I stood there a moment in the empty lot, letting my 2 lungs breathe air that didn't smell of carpet glue. And then I heard it. From a pickup truck parked a few rows over, window down, someone had the radio on low. An old country song. And the person inside was humming along. Off-key, the exact kind of off-key of someone who doesn't care that they sing badly. I stood frozen in the middle of the parking lot, both hands holding my brother's box of photos, and for 20 seconds I couldn't breathe. Because that was the boy's song. That was the way the boy sang it. The boy whose dog tag was in my pocket. I'll tell you about him. His name was Wyatt Doyle. We called him Kip. He was 21, from a town in Tennessee I've still never had the courage to set foot in, and he was a pararescueman, a PJ in my unit. If you've never heard of a PJ, here's what you need to know. They're the ones who jump into the worst place on earth to pull other people out. Their motto is that others may live, not a slogan for a wall. A contract. Kip had those 4 words tattooed on his ribs. He hummed constantly. In the helicopter cabin, before every mission, when the rest of us sat quiet in each our own private silence, Kip would hum that off-key country song, and at first it drove people crazy, and then after a while it became the sound that meant we were still okay. If Kip was singing, the world hadn't ended yet. 11 years ago, in a valley in Kunar, a SEAL platoon was pinned down on a ridgeline. They'd walked into an ambush. 3 wounded, 1 badly, and the terrain was too steep and too hot in both senses, to bring them out by ground. That's when they call units like mine. We were the last option. We were the name the men on the ground called into the radio when they'd run out of every other choice. They didn't know our names. To them, we were just a call sign coming out of the radio. A voice telling them to hold on. We were coming. My call sign was Halo. We flew in while it was still light, which we shouldn't have done, because the badly wounded man wouldn't live until dark. I made that call. That was my job, weighing the lives of the men on the ground against the lives of the men in my helicopter, and choosing. No one teaches you how to live with those calculations afterward. They only teach you how to make them fast. We fast roped down, dropped on ropes through incoming fire. Kip went down before me. I still remember him looking back at me right before the door opened, and he grinned, and he started to hum. On the ground, we found the SEAL platoon. The most badly wounded was a young soldier shot in the thigh and the abdomen, bleeding out fast. Kip got to him first. Kip always got to the worst one first. That was who he was. We got them down. All of them. The whole SEAL platoon, and the soldier who'd been shot. The one Kip pressed the wound closed on with his own 2 hands across 200 meters of steep terrain under fire, refusing to let go, humming that damn song through clenched teeth to keep both of them calm. That soldier lived. Kip didn't. In the last few meters, as we were nearly to the helicopter, a gunman on the ridge fired one final burst. Kip turned his body to shield the soldier lying on the litter. He shielded him with himself. I was the one who took the dog tag off his neck. It's procedure. You keep one for identification. But when I pulled it off, a fragment had lodged in the lower left corner of the metal, leaving a small notch. I've kept that dog tag ever since. I told myself I kept it for his family. But I never brought it to them. 11 years. I carried it in my pocket, and I avoided that town in Tennessee, and I let the story of how Kip Doyle died, like a hero, so a stranger could live, stay buried along with everything else I wasn't allowed to say. That was the cost of my silence I never dared to count. I stood in the parking lot, and the humming from that pickup faded as the driver pulled away, and I wiped my face with the back of my hand. Once, and I carried my brother's box of photos back inside. Because I came to be Ryan's sister. That was tonight's job. Inside, the ceremony had moved to the awards portion. My father was at his very best. The cameras were rolling. The officers were speaking. And he sat at the main family table beaming as if every honor in the room belonged to him. He stood up to raise a toast. No one had invited him to. He just stood, because that's what he does. To my son, he said, his voice thick with liquor and with the emotion he mistook for pride but which was closer to relief. Relief that finally someone carrying the Marsh name had done the thing he never could. This boy is a real hero. Not everyone in this family has the guts to be a soldier. His eyes flicked toward the back of the room. Toward me, just for a moment. But at least one of them did. A few people clapped. An older officer at the next table, a colonel, I guessed from the way he sat, didn't clap. He frowned, and his eyes moved from my father to me, and I saw something flicker in them. Not recognition. Not yet. Just the uneasy feeling of an old soldier seeing something that doesn't fit. A person leaning against the wall at the back of the room with a spine too straight, a stillness too disciplined, to be someone who quit after 2 weeks. He didn't say anything. But he looked at me a second longer than normal. And I turned my face away, because I didn't want to be seen. I'd spent the whole evening not being seen. I set the box of photos down beside the stage. And I went back to my table at the back of the room. 11 years. 2 more rotations after that valley. 19 souls carried off mountainsides that no one back home would ever count. One dog tag, worn smooth, in my coat pocket. 800 people in this room. And the number that mattered most was 0. That's how many of them knew. And then Ryan stepped up to the podium to tell the story. Here's the cruelest thing about that evening, crueler than anything my father ever said. And no one in the room knew it was cruel, not even the person causing it. Ryan took the microphone, and he began to tell it, about the valley. 11 years ago, he said, and his voice, the big, confident voice he used to tell this story 100 times already, dropped a little. My platoon walked into a trap. We were pinned on a ridgeline. We had 3 wounded. And I'll be honest with you, we thought that was it. The room went still. This was a different kind of silence than when my father spoke. This was the silence of 800 people holding their breath at once. Then we heard a voice on the radio. Ryan said, "A rescue team." Their call sign was Halo. I stopped breathing. I sat at the farthest table in the room, invisible, the daughter who quit, and I listened to my brother tell 800 people about the day I saved his life, and he didn't know. He spoke my call sign with a reverence that cracked his voice in the middle. He talked about the angels who flew in broad daylight, which no one is crazy enough to do, and they got us out. He talked about a PJ who shielded one of his men with his own body and died. I never knew his name, Ryan said, and now he was crying. A Navy SEAL crying on a stage in front of 800 people. I never knew his name. But he died so one of my brothers could live. And not a day goes by that I don't think about those nameless angels. He had a name, Ryan. His name was Kip Doyle. He was 21. He sang terribly. And the woman who took him into that valley, the one who made the call that killed him and saved your brother, is sitting 15 meters from you. And our whole family just spent the entire evening telling her she's never done a thing in her life. I didn't say those words. I sat still. My hand tightened around Kip's dog tag. And that's when the host stepped up and thanked Ryan and said, "Tonight we're also honored to have with us some of the survivors of that operation. Please stand so we can recognize you." And in the row of chairs to the right, a man pushed back his chair and stood up. He stood with effort, one hand braced on the edge of the table, because one of his legs was metal and carbon fiber. He'd lost that leg 11 years ago, in a valley, when a fragment tore through his thigh and his abdomen, and a 21-year-old boy pressed the wound closed with 2 hands across 200 meters. His name is Marcus Diaz. He was the soldier who'd been shot. He was the one Kip died to save. And he didn't stand up and look toward the stage, where they'd told him to look. He stood up and turned his head, slowly sweeping the room, searching for something. Searching for a face. The face of the woman who'd held him on the litter when he thought he was dying. Who'd told him, "You're not dying today," soldier in a voice so calm he believed her. And he lived. His eyes stopped at the back of the room. Stopped on me. The whole hall began to turn to follow his gaze. He walked toward me. The sound of his prosthetic leg touched down on the wooden floor. Dry, steady, 1 sound per step, and it was the only sound in the entire room of 800 people. He stopped a few steps from me. And he said, quietly, almost soundless, a name I hadn't heard anyone say in 11 years. "Halo." I didn't confirm it out loud. I never once said out loud who I was. That's not who I am. I just reached into my coat pocket, and I drew out the dog tag, and I opened my palm. Diaz looked down. He saw the name engraved on it. He saw the small notch in the lower left corner. And I watched the moment he realized what it was, the dog tag of the man who died on top of him, and his legs, both the flesh one and the metal one, nearly buckled. He brought a hand up to cover his mouth. "It's you," he said. "This whole time. It's you." What happened next isn't like what you imagine about moments like this. There was no order shouted out. No 400 pairs of boots stamping down on the floor at once. That's not how it happens with real people. in a real room. Diaz stood there, hand over his mouth, crying without a sound. And then at the table beside him, another man stood up, a veteran. I could tell by the way he stood. Then one more, slower at a table behind. Then a whole corner of the room. Not all at once. Not perfectly. A ragged, patchy wave. This person and then that one, each standing as they understood. The soldiers in the room piecing it together faster than the civilians. A combat rescue team leader, standing at the back of the room, while they'd told her to sit at the overflow table. And in the middle of that wave of people standing up, one person stayed seated. My father. He sat at the main family table, and everyone around him was standing up, and he didn't understand why. And then he began to understand, and I watched it drain from his face like a tide pulling back from a shore, leaving him gray and bare. His two hands, the two hands that had held the bourbon and told the story of the daughter who quit, gripped the edge of the table. He was the last one still sitting in a room full of people standing. And my mother. My mother stood near the stage, and in her hand was still the wine glass she'd polished all evening, the glass she used so she wouldn't have to look straight at me. And when she understood, when she saw the dog tag in my hand, saw the veteran crying in front of me, saw the whole room stand up for the daughter she'd told to sit at the overflow table, the glass slipped from her fingers. It fell. And it shattered on the wooden floor, a small and clear and final sound, and it was the first time in my life I ever saw my mother with nothing in her hands to wipe. Ryan was still standing at the podium. He looked down at me. And I watched on my brother's face the terrible process of two truths, which had lived side by side in his head for 11 years without ever touching, finally colliding. The first truth, his weak sister quit long ago. The second truth, the nameless angels saved his life, and he'd worshipped them for 11 years. He never knew they were the same person. His voice cracked through the microphone, ringing across the dead silent room. I've told Halo's story 100 times. 100 times. I never knew her face. I never knew it was. He couldn't finish. He set the microphone down, and he stepped off the stage, and he walked toward me across a room full of people standing, and he was a boy again, not a Navy SEAL, just the little brother who used to sleep in the hallway outside my room on stormy nights. The older colonel, the one who'd frowned earlier, stepped up to the podium and took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice was steady in the way only people who've spent a lifetime in the service can be. "The woman at the back of the room is Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Marsh. Combat Rescue Officer. Recipient of the Silver Star and the Airman's Medal. Commander of the mission we are remembering tonight." He paused. "I think we've had the recognition in the wrong place all evening. And of all the things I could have said, after 18 years, after everything my father had said, after the overflow table and the bourbon and at least one of them did, I said only one sentence. I didn't say it about myself. I looked at Diaz, the man with the metal leg crying in front of me, the man who lived, and I gripped the dog tag in my hand, and I said, quietly, just loud enough for him alone to hear, "You're standing here because of the kid. Not because of me." Then I said nothing more. Because that was always the truth. And that truth didn't need me to say it loud for it to be true. People like to think that moment was the ending. The arrogant one brought low, the scorned one vindicated, the curtain falling. But life doesn't fall a curtain. Life just goes on, slow and messy, into the next morning and all the mornings after. I need you to understand something, and I need you to understand it right. I didn't get up from that table a different person. I didn't learn my lesson. I didn't recognize my mistake and grow. I'd been that same person all evening, the woman who took Kip into the valley, who held Diaz on the litter, who carried a dog tag in her pocket for 11 years. Nothing in me changed in that moment. What changed was what the room saw. And maybe, just maybe, what I finally let myself see. Because here's what I was wrong about for 11 years, and I'll say it straight. Once, because it's the one thing in this story I want you to take with you. I always believed silence was dignity. That if I knew who I was, other people getting me wrong couldn't touch me. And maybe that was true when the silence only hid me. But my silence didn't only hide me. It hid Kip. Every time I let my father call me a quitter and swallowed it, I was also swallowing the story of a 21-year-old boy who died so a stranger could live. My humility, that I'd been so proud of, turned out to be a door I closed in his face. He deserved to be told. And I kept him in my pocket, silent for 11 years, and told myself it was respect. There's a difference between dignity and absence. It took me 11 years to see that line. Dignity is knowing who you are and not needing to prove it. Absence is disappearing so completely that the people you owe a truth never get it. I won't pretend I know whether I should forgive my father. I don't think he deserves it. That's the part of the story I still haven't worked out, and I suspect I never will. Not completely. But I know this. I don't owe him my silence anymore. And more than that, I owe Kip my voice. My father never apologized. I want to tell you about a beautiful reconciliation in the parking lot. A broken man. Tears, a fresh start. But I promised you at the very beginning that I'd tell you the truth. And the truth is he stood by his car in the parking lot that night, and he opened his mouth a few times, and nothing came out. The man who'd talked loud for 40 years finally couldn't find a single word. Maybe because, for the first time, there was no story to stand behind him. All that was left was the silence he'd been afraid of his whole life. I left him standing in it. That wasn't a punishment. I didn't stage it. It was just what's left of a man when the story he built gets pulled away. With my mother, there were no words either. Just a broken glass on the floor, and a woman who finally had nothing in her hands to wipe. But with Ryan, it was different. My brother came to me a few days later, and we sat in my kitchen, and he cried, and I let him cry. He kept saying it, over and over. I told that story 100 times, as if he said it enough times, he could turn back time and know. And I told him what I believe is true. None of it was his fault. He couldn't have known. That's exactly what makes people like Kip who they are. They save you, and you never know their name, and they want it that way. That's the whole meaning of that others may live. The one who lives owes nothing. The one who lives just has to live. We mended, Ryan and I. Just Ryan. Not the whole family. Not my father. There are cracks that don't heal just because the truth finally comes out, and I've stopped pretending they will. But I got my brother back. And I realized that sometimes family isn't everyone who shares your blood sitting around a table. Sometimes family is the one person willing to sit in the pain with you without trying to fix it. 3 weeks later, I drove to Tennessee. I'd avoided that town for 11 years. I found the house, a small wooden house with a porch swing and a front yard with grass that hadn't been trimmed neat in a long time. A woman came to the door. She was older than I'd pictured, and in her face I saw Kip's face, the same eyes, the same way of squinting into the sun. I introduced myself. I told her I'd been there that day. And I sat at her kitchen table, and for the first time in 11 years, I told a mother how her son died. Not the version in the Army's telegram. The real version. That he got to the most badly wounded man first, because he always did. That he held a stranger closed across 200 meters of steep ground under fire and wouldn't let go. That he hummed even then, that off-key country song, to keep both of them calm. That he shielded the other man with his own body in the last few meters. That the man is alive. That the man has a metal leg and a life and maybe children, all because of her son. And I set the dog tag on the table between us. The small notch in the lower left corner turned up. I should have brought this to you a long time ago, I said. I'm sorry I waited so long. She picked up the dog tag. She held it in her hand the way I'd held it for 11 years. And she said, quietly, he sang terribly, Didn't he? The worst I ever heard, I said. And we laughed together. And then we cried together. And somewhere outside the window a radio in some passing car was playing. And I swear to you, just for a moment, I heard an old country song. I left the dog tag with her. It was never mine to keep. For 11 years it was a weight I carried in my pocket, a secret a notch cutting into my palm. Now it's a name a mother can say out loud. A story a mother can tell. That was the only thing I ever really wanted out of that evening. Not for my father to be brought low. Not for 800 people to stand up. Just for a 21-year-old boy to finally be called by his right name. Thank you for staying with me to the very end of this story. I spent 11 years learning something I wish I'd known sooner. There's a difference between being humble and disappearing, and the cost of disappearing is rarely paid by you alone. If you're watching this, I want to ask you 3 things. Have you ever let your family believe a smaller version of who you are, just to keep the peace? Are you carrying a truth in your pocket that you owe to someone else, not to yourself? And if you stopped being silent tomorrow, who would finally be seen? Tell me in the comments. And let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. If this story meant something to you, leave a like and subscribe. Not for me, but for the people like Kip, the names that deserve to be said out loud. Take care of yourself. And I'll see you in the next story.